But today they announced they'd reached the turning point. The Russians have released the clearest pictures yet of the damage caused by the explosion and fire at Chernobyl 2 weeks ago. Work is now being carried out to prevent the reactor's core contaminating water supplies. If that's successful, they say Chernobyl could soon be back on the Soviet power grid. From Moscow, Brian Hanrahan reports.
Soviet television has now given its viewers a glimpse inside the danger zone, together with an interview with one of the country's top nuclear scientists saying that a catastrophe is no longer possible. The camera inside a moving car showed the deserted houses and a few military vehicles bringing in food for those still working. Although the police had face masks secured, the other workers glimpsed did not appear to be wearing theirs, and nobody had any special protective clothing. The scientists said pictures of the plant, which showed the fire out, were backed by technical evidence. Now they would try to encapsulate the radioactive elements and prevent them from leaking into the water table. This was being done by freezing the soil and bringing in concrete in which the reactor would be buried. Eventually, it should be possible to reopen the other generators on the site. Brian Hanrahan for BBC News, Moscow.
3 diplomats have been ordered out of Syria. The appears to be direct retaliation to Britain's expulsion yesterday of 3 Syrian diplomats. The British diplomats have been told to leave Damascus within a week. The Foreign Office has
I believe this was a fair test of my commandability.
Power plant says human error was to blame. It speaks of 6 unbelievable blunders by engineers who were carrying out an unauthorized experiment while the plant was still operating, an experiment which ironically was intended to improve the plant's safety procedures. In the words of the report, the engineers lost all sense of the danger of their surroundings. The investigators' findings were made public at a news conference in Moscow. They also revealed that 4 months after the plant blew up, radiation is still contaminating the atmosphere. Their report gives a detailed account of the fateful experiment that led to the world's worst nuclear accident. The countdown to disaster began when the engineers allowed the reactor core to heat up by removing some of the control rods. That speeded up the nuclear reaction. Mistake number 2, they deliberately switched off the device which automatically controls the reactor's power level. Then they allowed too much water to flow through the cooling system, which caused dangerous problems later on. Stage 4, they tampered with another safety device, switching off the system which warns when the water level gets too low. Then, simply so they could carry on with their experiment, they switched off the automatic shutdown system, the reactor's most important safety equipment. And the final and catastrophic blunder, they turned off the emergency cooling system for 12 hours. So when they started their unauthorized experiment with all the safety systems out of action, the reactor blew apart.
The report is brutally frank about the blunders which caused the world's worst nuclear accident. There were gross errors made at almost every stage of the experiment being carried out on a generator. But what made it a tragedy was that for 12 hours the cooling system was turned off. Steam was allowed to accumulate and there was a chemical explosion. At today's news conference we were told by leading Soviet experts that all this had been as a result of complacency and negligence by the staff at the plant.
Such a sequence of human actions was so unlikely that the engineer did not include into his project such a possible scenario.
Direct questions about possible design faults in the reactor were brushed aside, but it was accepted that the designers had not been psychologically prepared for such a catalogue of errors. And the report details the human, economic and environmental damage of Chernobyl. On health, 31 people dead, 203 seriously radiated, and hundreds of thousands more who will have to be screened for the rest of their lives, including the children who were hurriedly packed off to summer camp and the expectant mothers who've had abortions. The evacuation, involving as it did the transportation of 135,000 people from a 20-mile danger zone. Some have returned home, but many will have to live in settlements, now hastily being built before the winter, for decades. The nuclear industry is now being investigated by a special team of scientists. They'll be looking at the reactor design and safety measures, the wisdom of siting them near heavily populated areas, and the high level of power that they're expected to produce each year. It has been an expensive and painful experience for the Soviet Union, and despite the report's explanation, many find it hard to believe that the blame lies solely with plant workers, many of whom are either dead or are likely to die as a direct consequence of the disaster. This is Peter Ruff for the 9 o'clock news in Moscow.
The latest Soviet report on the mistakes which led to the disaster will be studied eagerly by scientists around the world. But the question in the minds of many people will be, could it happen here?
Even if an operator at a central electricity generating board nuclear reactor switched off all the safety systems that he could lay his hands on, the way in which the reactors behave in Britain is very different. The Soviet reactors are, in a sense, inherently unstable in operation. If you fiddle with them a little bit, then they're likely to go onto the boil very quickly. You have to be very nimble and very fast and know what you're doing. The behavior of British reactors is much more stable, much more slow. You have time to realize that you've made a mistake and to correct it before you do any serious damage.
The Soviet Union appears to have ruled out paying compensation to countries affected by fallout from Chernobyl. In London today, the Soviet ambassador Leonid Zemyatin said it had been accepted internationally that radiation levels outside the Soviet Union hadn't risen above acceptable limits or caused serious damage. But Britain's farmers disagree. They say the restrictions on the movement of their sheep since Chernobyl has cost them £10 million.
John Stalker, the suspended Deputy Chief Constable of Greater Manchester,
in order to reduce the radiation levels, have sustained.
The Soviets released little hard information today about the aftermath of the accident, but they did say 135,000 people have been evacuated from their homes. That's a third higher than had been thought. New homes are now being built for many evacuees, a sign that some may never return. Soviet officials also confirmed that 31 people have now died because of Chernobyl, while another 203 are still suffering acute radiation sickness. In the long term, though, the threat to the whole of Europe is of a slight but still serious increase in cases of cancer.
The long-term effects in terms of cancer will be seen over the whole of Western Europe. In this country, we might expect, say, 400 or so cancers, some of which will be fatal in the next 40 years or so. Over the whole of Europe, maybe a few thousands or maybe tens of thousands of cancers over that period.
The crippled reactor is still leaking radioactivity, but at levels that probably won't pose a health risk. Soviet engineers will now try and make the reactor completely safe by enclosing it in concrete. In future, Soviet officials say reactors may have to be built further away from population centers. And, crucially, they've admitted there may have to be design modifications to all the Soviets' RBMK reactors, including better control systems. But today, British experts were not satisfied that such changes would bring the reactors up to Western standards. Indeed, some saw the changes as an admission that the design of the reactor itself, not simply operator error, was the main reason for the Chernobyl catastrophe.
I'm sure that that is true. I doubt myself whether they can make this reactor sufficiently safe within the constraints of making the reactor, allowing the reactor to continue to be economic.
So are you dismayed or relieved by what you've heard today?
I'm relieved that we've got a very clear picture of what happened. I'm dismayed that other reactors of this type are still being operated.
Walter Patterson, one American scientist today said it sounded a little bit like a power plant being run by the Marx Brothers. Do you think that's true? Is it really human error was to blame for this disaster, or is there a question about a design fault?
Well, as the last speaker said, all the error is human error. It starts at the conceptual stage, it goes through the design stage, construction, operation, maintenance. They're all human beings doing those things.
But was it an operator or a designer error?
What we are talking about here, I think, is an interaction between operator error of an extreme kind and the failure of a designer to recognize that his machine might be vulnerable to this kind of extreme operator error with catastrophic results.
Well, looking at the design part and in language that a layman can understand, what sort of modifications do you think could be made?
I'm not by any means clear that modifications would deal with it. This is the difficulty. This is a very, very complex machine. It may well be that trying to modify some part of it may well aggravate the problem somewhere else. And as we have heard this evening, this sequence of events is obviously extremely improbable. But one of the crucial things that happened is exactly the same as happened at 3 Mile Island. The operator shut off the emergency cooling water at a key stage in the accident.
So you're saying it's the very nature of the energy which is the problem. There is no design that can contain it safely.
I wouldn't go that far, but I am very unhappy about a design in which water is used to cool nuclear fuel, because the water is the source of the hydrogen which caused the main explosion.
What about the personnel? The Soviets admitted today, the Soviet Union admitted today that the personnel were poorly trained.
Inadequately trained. I'm afraid that that is something that is endemic throughout a great deal of the nuclear industry, although I'm confident that it is not a problem in the UK. I think it's already been demonstrated to be a problem even in an industrial country like the US, and I am afraid that it might be a serious problem in many other countries.
What about the question of relocating some plants? If they do decide to relocate, will they find themselves with half-built plants, planned plants in places they're going to have to move?
Well, they certainly can't move them once they've started building them.
But they can abandon them.
They could abandon them, but that presents the Soviet authorities with a major dilemma, because at the moment, the RBMK design of reactor represents 10% of the electricity supply capacity of the Soviet Union. To shut down all those reactors would mean that next winter, the Soviet Union would be faced with a pretty cold winter.
Are they not faced with it already? I mean, today we've had reports that their energy managers have been told to stock up heavily for the winter.
I agree, and I think I think they should have been doing so anyway. I think we should be doing the same thing in the UK, so as to reduce our vulnerability to this kind of problem. But if you consider that there are, for example, 4 reactors of this kind, older reactors of this kind, without as many safety features, on the outskirts of Leningrad, that shows you the kind of dilemma that the Soviet authorities are now facing.
And they're caught with the locations as they are.
Indeed.
John Dunster, what about the evacuation procedures? I mean, if the radiation levels were as high, if not much higher, than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, should there have been much more widespread evacuation than there was?
Well, they certainly weren't much higher than they were at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The acute deaths we've heard about have been inside the plant. We have no information that suggests that anybody outside the plant has received doses which are acutely fatal. So I think the doses are much lower than those at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's impossible to judge at this stage whether the evacuation took place early enough. My instinct says no, that they should have done it some days before. They had several days in which they did not evacuate people, and my instinct tells me that they must have, it would have been better if they'd done it earlier. On the other hand, they had a very large operation to conduct, and I'm not sure how easy it is to achieve this on the day. It's easy to sit back and criticise it and say, well, they should have been doing something else as well, but they had a fire to put out, and that must have committed a good deal of their resources. They may have done the best that was possible, but they may have delayed the decision. I simply don't know yet. It's one of the things I hope to find out next week.
They've told us there are 31 people dead, another 40 seriously ill. What about the long-term deaths from this incident?
We shan't know that. We've got a better picture of the radiation doses. Making guesses, it seems unlikely that the total death toll in the end, spread over some 50 years, is going to be less than about 1,000, and it might be substantially higher than that. There will be, in addition to that, a number of non-fatal cancers, because the irradiation of the thyroid does cause a high proportion of non-fatal conditions. So they have a public health problem. It's not large in terms of the total numbers of deaths which will occur. That's in a population which is probably 1 million, and in a period where there will be 500,000 deaths. So it's a small addition. In fact, even that is a misstatement, because you can't have extra deaths. All you're doing is to transfer the cause of death from something else to Chernobyl as a cause.
Well, looking at their food supplies and looking at their agriculture, what sort of effect will it have on that?
It must have quite a serious effect on their agriculture for this harvest. I mean, they have substantially damaged the surface crops. They will not be saleable, they will not be usable. There will be some transfer of radioactivity through the soil into next year's crops. And again, this is one of the things we're very anxious to find out more about. Not only in terms of finding out what the hazards of those crops are, but because it will tell us a great deal about the way that radioactivity does move through the environment.
But in time, will it disappear?
Yes, it takes quite a long time. We're talking about tens of years, perhaps, for the thing to be completely...
And what about areas outside Russia? We've been reading today, for instance, that in Scandinavia, lichen and berries and other wild things growing have been affected, and indeed their reindeer are going to be affected.
The reindeer and the position in the near tundra area of the north of Scandinavia has always been a very peculiar one. The reindeers have to cover an enormous area to get nourishment because they're eating off a very, very sparse vegetation. And the result is that they take in a vast amount of radioactivity compared, for example, with the cow, which is grazing relatively lush pasture. So the reindeer have always been a problem for this, in this type of situation, whether it's fallout from weapons or accidents. And they've certainly had to dispose of a good many reindeer.
Well, looking forward to the meeting in Vienna, can I ask you both, starting with you, Walter Patterson, what do you not know today that you want to know that you hope you're going to find out in Vienna?
I would like to know what kind of modifications the Soviet authorities intend to make or are making to their reactors that gives them the confidence to go on operating them, even considering this particular accident. And I would like to know what their longer-term policy changes are likely to be as a result of the accident and the investigation of it. I think at Vienna we will hear a great deal about the history of the accident and about what happened, but I hope we will also hear about what is going to happen within the Soviet Union and in terms of international cooperation, about data gathering, data analysis, and so on, so as to gain what benefit we can from this catastrophe.
And John Dunster, what about you? I mean, the radiological side is
I too am looking for policy. I want to know at what level they decide to evacuate, more particularly at what level of radiation dose are they prepared to let people come back to their homes. I want to know much more about the agricultural situation. I want to know a lot about the levels of dose they're exposing workers to now, not only in clean-up, but in preparing to operate the rest of the site.
And looking at the sort of press conference we got today, rather open press conference, do you think you're going to get the answers to those questions?
We shall get the answers as to what they did. We may get the answers to why they did it. I'm slightly less confident about that second point.
Wiesenthal Centre in Vienna, which tracks down war criminals, has handed a list of names to the British government.
Most of those responsible for the horrors of the extermination camps have never been brought to justice. Those who have were mostly Germans and Ukrainians. In the Baltic states, where the 17 men on the Wiesenthal list came from, few, if any, have been caught. In the chaos as the war ended, people from the Baltic states who had worked for the SS were lucky. The Nazis, out of gratitude, had brought them to Germany, and they were able to pass themselves off as former slave labourers, the victims of Nazism. Most got away to the United States or Australia. A few came to Britain. From this undistinguished building in what was once the Jewish quarter of Vienna, the hunt continues for those war criminals who escaped. Simon Wiesenthal's documentation centre has to be guarded day and night by the police. These are busy days for him. Valuable new records have come to light about the movement of refugees from post-war Europe. It's these records which have provided the names of the 17 men on his organisation's list. Wiesenthal already has the details of how the Nazis recruited them.
They equip them, they give them uniforms, they give them bullets, and they give them orders, and they fulfill it. And the guilt of these people is bigger than the guilt of the Nazis. Why? Because with their future victims, they was living in the same places, going to the same school, sometime in the same houses.
Many of the 17 who are being named may now be dead, but Wiesenthal has known of the British link for some time. Last year, for instance, he got evidence which led him to believe that in this quiet house in a suburb of Leicester, the man nicknamed the Butcher of Estonia lived out his life peacefully and died in 1969. He had, Wiesenthal says, been in charge of all the concentration camps in Estonia.
I'm sure that people will react when they will find out that their neighbors are people they commit crimes.
There are always going to be people who say this happened so long ago, we should just forget about it.
What happened in the Nazi period, you cannot compare with some other events in the human history. And a murderer, after 40 years, he remains a murderer.
Knew the meaning of the word aoun.
Pravda on Leonid Brezhnev is seen as the start of a de-Brezhnevization campaign by Mr. Gorbachev.
Well, now let's take a look at what's in the morning. Trade and industry is also caught up in Britain's insider dealing scandal, are reported in The Guardian.
And most of the papers can't resist the historic meeting between Labour's Roy Hattersley and his spitting image double. Can you spot the real one?
The touching story of the wife who's just undergone the world's first ever heart, lung and liver transplant takes up the whole of today's front page. Some lovely pictures there.
And the sport...
Ratushinskaya is here in Britain. She arrived in London last night to a hero's, or was it a heroine's, welcome. Accompanied by her husband Igor, the 32-year-old Christian dissident was met by a group of supporters who cheered and presented her with flowers. Although she was tired and rather weak, she made a brief statement.
I'm very pleased that the first land on which we both are really free, it is British land. I'm very thankful for all people of good wish from different countries who helped me to get out from prison.
Well, hailed as one of the Soviet Union's most talented modern poets, Irina spent more than 3 years in prison for alleged anti-Soviet propaganda. She was released in October. Well, now she and her husband have been granted 3-month exit visas, and Irina will have medical treatment while she's in Britain. The couple will be staying with the Reverend Dr. Dick Rogers, who's one of the many people who've been campaigning for her release. And he's in the studio with me now. Dr. Rogers, she's been through an awful lot. What sort of state is she in at the moment?
I think she's quite weak. She's got a very nasty cough, and she's going to a London teaching hospital today to be examined to see what sort of treatment she needs.
What sort of thing has she actually been through in the Gulag prisons? Because it all sounds pretty horrendous to us in the West.
Well, she spent many months for defending other Christian women prisoners with her head shaved in a freezing cell on a piece of bread a day the size of your fist, and every other day a cup of soup, and that was all. And she was left in her underwear during this period.
Was her health actually bad before, or do you think this has destroyed it?
She was a perfectly normal woman before, but on the way to the camp she got a kidney infection which was never treated, and I think probably what's happened is that that's gradually damaged her kidneys and given her very, very high blood pressure, which she was told would not be treated in the camp. And she developed very bad angina, pain in the chest and blackouts, all of which she was told would not be treated.
So how long is she likely to be over here for? I know she's got a 3-month exit visa, but might she be here for good now she's over?
Well, I think she might go back. It'd be marvellous if she felt that the environment in the Soviet Union had liberalised sufficiently to allow her to express her faith and her feelings about life back in the Soviet Union. I doubt it, though, personally. I think she may settle here, or she may go to friends in Chicago or somewhere like that. We'll have to wait and see what she thinks.
Well, you yourself have done some absolutely extraordinary things on her behalf. I mean, I remember you fasting in a cage in Birmingham. I mean, why get involved to that extent?
Well, I just felt that God was telling me to get off my backside and do something rather than just natter about it. And I think it helped people to understand a little bit about the fact that, I mean, these are real people. It's happening right at the moment. You know, the Soviet Union executes about 800 people a year for criminal offences, and double that number meet their death in the uranium mines in Siberia. It's just another world, and yet it's not very far away geographically.
Well, very briefly, do you think this is a full-scale change of heart by the Soviets, or do you think it's just a one-off because of your campaign?
I'll wait and see what they do with Alexander Ogorodnikov, who has been sitting in a cell covered with sewage, flooded with sewage deliberately, and he hasn't seen his wife only once in 8 years. So let's see what they do with that.
So the fight goes on. Dr. Rogers, thank you.
Well, it's now time to look at some of the other stories that are happening later today.
Andrei Sakharov have been irregularly supplied by the KGB. Often called the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, it was Sakharov's use of his position and prestige to criticize the Kremlin's disregard for human rights that set him at odds with the authorities. His eventual banishment triggered the most sustained and fervent campaigning in the West, from New York to Paris, for his freedom. From the White House to the Elysee Palace, his relatives and human rights activists ensured his presence on the agenda of every superpower summit. His release was announced as if it were a simple matter of course, the Soviet deputy foreign minister saying that Sakharov had merely asked to leave Gorky.
The decision was taken to grant that request and to allow academic Sakharov to return to Moscow.
The Sakharov news is one of several new signals coming out of Moscow. It comes, for example, on a day when the name Leonid Brezhnev, for the first time since his death 4 years ago, has been attacked in the pages of Pravda. Brezhnev is condemned today for having led the Soviet Union into an economic slump. The West is still analyzing what signal Sakharov's freedom implies. There are still hundreds of lesser-known dissidents in captivity, but Sakharov, unlike most of his dissident colleagues, never wanted to leave Russia. He just wanted to resume his work at the Moscow Academy of Sciences, and that tonight is exactly what the Russians say he may now do.
The MI5 spy book spent challenging the Soviet government on human rights and foreign policy. The Russians say he'd asked to be allowed to return home, and they'd agreed. Reporting from Moscow, Brian Hanrahan.
Since Sakharov was exiled to Gorky in 1980, he's become the symbol of those campaigning against the Soviet record on human rights. By sending him there, to a city closed to foreigners, the Soviet authorities sought to end his public criticism of their behavior. But his treatment attracted considerable international attention. The Soviet authorities brushed it all aside until today's sudden announcement that he was free to return to Moscow and resume his work as a physicist at the Academy of Sciences. His wife, Yelena Bonner, who for several years had acted as a communication channel to him until she too was confined to Gorky, is to be allowed to return as well. Sources here suggest that the two of them will be back in Moscow very soon. The change of attitude, which came unexpectedly during a Moscow news conference, comes at a time when the Soviet Union has been trying to improve its international image on human rights and has released a number of well-known dissidents. Sharansky, Orlov, and most recently Irina Ratushinskaya, who flew to London yesterday, have all benefited from this new approach. But critics say the benefits have yet to be felt by thousands of lesser-known prisoners.
In releasing Dr. Sakharov, the Soviet Union is clearing away the principal international blemish on its human rights record. But it's also taking a gamble that Dr. Sakharov, when he returns to Moscow, will not again start talking to reporters and spotlighting other human rights cases.
Earlier this year, Mr. Gorbachev said that Dr. Sakharov could not be allowed to go abroad because he knew state secrets. But one hint that Sakharov, freed in Moscow, might not be a problem comes from a letter the physicist wrote to the Soviet leader last year. He offered to give up public activity, apart from speaking on exceptional cases, if he was allowed to resume his scientific work. This is Brian Hanrahan for the 6 o'clock news in Moscow.
Andrei Sakharov's release from exile has been warmly welcomed by governments in the West. Britain's Foreign Secretary Sir Geoffrey Howe described it as a long-delayed reaction to the weight of world opinion. In Washington, President Reagan's spokesman Larry Speakes said it was a personal victory for the principles of human rights. Both governments expressed the hope that Sakharov's release would be the start of a more tolerant attitude to dissent in the Soviet Union. Our diplomatic editor John Simpson, who met Sakharov 2 years before he was sent into exile, explains the significance of his release today.
Dr. Andrei Sakharov, having once been his country's greatest physicist, became by the 1970s its most prominent dissident. That means that the Soviet authorities have always had a big problem knowing how to deal with him. And the way they dealt with him has always provided the outside world with a clear indication of the Soviet attitude towards criticism at home in general. When he was exiled to Gorky, the dissident movement was smashed. And now that Mr. Gorbachev is calling for a new atmosphere at home, Dr. Sakharov has been released. When I went to see him in 1978 and filmed this interview, he was the acknowledged head of the dissident movement, the first to know and protest about each new person arrested. As he indicated to me with his characteristically gentle humour, the walls and ceilings of his flat were studded with hidden microphones. The KGB didn't dare to touch him at that stage, though. But in 1980, relations with the West worsened after the invasion of Afghanistan, and the KGB moved in and had him exiled to Gorky, where no foreigners are allowed to go. There, its agents followed him about and filmed him ceaselessly. It was a sign of their insensitivity to Western feelings that they should have sold these videos in the West in order to disprove the frequent rumours that he was dying. But he was often ill, and the KGB cameras even intruded into his hospital. But the authorities' biggest nightmare was that he or his wife Yelena Bonner would die in exile, and the Sakharovs played on this by staging occasional hunger strikes, which the authorities usually gave in to. Exactly a year ago, they allowed Yelena Bonner to go to the United States for treatment, the first sign that conditions for both of them might improve. Mr. Gorbachev is no Western liberal, but he knows a bad public relations risk when he sees one, and he knows that exiling Dr. Sakharov is precisely that. He must now feel strong enough to override any KGB doubts about the wisdom of releasing him. But so far, all that's happened is that Mr. Gorbachev is returning to the more relaxed atmosphere of the early 70s, nothing more. There are still at least 600 prisoners of conscience in Soviet jails, and people like Dr. Anatoly Kuryagin, who's serving a sentence for complaining against the Soviet abuse of psychiatry, are still held in cruel conditions in the camps.
In Australia, the MI5 secrets case has ended, but the result won't be known.
As I can in whatever field I'm operating in.
It was not the cold, the filth, the vermin, or the long days in punishment cells, but the plight of older women convicts.
It was very hard, but we didn't it. It was the most hard thing, and besides of it, I was more young woman in our camp, and it was very painful to see what our militaries does with the women in age of my mother.
But physically, it was hard, wasn't it?
Surely. Last year, I was sure I wouldn't be alive in our prison and in our cell, because it was very cold there, and they gave our meals to us the day after one.
Every other day?
Every other day. And it was very dirty, and I haven't any medicine treatment all this time. So I really thought they are going to kill me.
A handful of swallows don't make a summer, a few freed dissenters a democracy. Anastasia's heart this week began a vigil, symbolically caged in a City of London church, to publicize the plight of Alexander Ogorodnikov, imprisoned in a Soviet labor camp since 1978 for founding a Christian discussion group. Mikhail Gorbachev has ushered in a new era in the Soviet Union, but the human rights clauses of the Helsinki agreements are still a Soviet Achilles heel. Ratushinskaya is held to be one of the finest living Soviet poets, and the best of her poetry so far was written in prison. Written surreptitiously, memorized for safety, and smuggled out.
Sometimes I had paper, and I could compose my rhymes on the sheet of paper, and then to remember and to burn the sheets, because they searched us every day, and I had to hide these sheets of paper or to burn it. And when I was in the cell, I was not allowed to have anything, and paper and pen were not allowed to me both. But I tried to compose my rhymes in my imagination, or on a piece of soap, or on the wall with a match, and then to clean what I have written.
And you remembered all your poems?
Yes, I remember all my poems. It was hard training, but I had to do it, because when I was arrested, I was not sure they haven't searched my husband and my friends, and I decided to save my rhymes in my brains, because they cannot search any brains.
How far do you see this as a risky policy, in the sense that Sakharov has not given up while he's been in Gorky, his wife has not given up, and allowed back to Moscow? Is there not a risk involved in this?
I would have said there is a risk. It depends partly on Sakharov's health and how active he actually can be. Mrs. Bonner, we all know, is by nature an extremely active woman, and it's hard to know how they will be controlled. But this is just part, I think, of the risk of the general Gorbachev policy on releasing some of the best-known dissidents. once he starts this process, he encourages people in the West to ask for more, and where does he stop? Maybe he has an answer to this, but I'm not quite sure what it can be.
That report by David Sells, and the full text of that interview with Irina Ratushinskaya will appear in The Observer this Sunday. Well, the decision to allow Sakharov and his wife to return to Moscow was made in a busy Soviet week. Hard on its heels came the announcement that nuclear testing would resume after a 16-month unilateral moratorium as soon as America held its first test in the new year. But it's the 2 days of street riots this week in the vast Asian Republic of Kazakhstan that have really set Soviet watchers humming with interest.
It's the second biggest of the Soviet republics, with ethnic Kazakhs making up nearly half the population. The rioting was sparked off by the removal on Tuesday of the politician who'd ruled the republic for 20 years. Dinmuhamed Kanayev, who's been replaced by a Russian, had been closely associated with the Brezhnev era and had been widely criticized for running a corrupt and inefficient party. The rioting, which TASS said had been sparked by nationalistic elements, was confirmed today by no less a person than the Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister, who accused hooligans and parasites of exploiting the situation. But no sooner had the events in Kazakhstan begun to sink in with the Kremlin watchers than an open attack was launched in Pravda on Leonid Brezhnev. His last years, said the paper, had been marked by a lack of purposefulness, determination and self-criticism. All points that Mikhail Gorbachev has stressed as part of his own drive for reform and renovation less than 2 years after taking over the Soviet leadership.
So, Mr. Gorbachev's changes, how real and how superficial? Here to discuss this are Archie Brown of St. Antony's College, Oxford, a Soviet expert, and Zhoris Medvedev, an exiled Soviet scientist who lives in London and is the author of a book about Mr. Gorbachev. Zhoris Medvedev, you know Andrei Sakharov.
Yes.
What is the message in his release from exile today?
No, I don't see any special message. I see this as a result of enormous pressure which was put on Soviet government, on all leaders from Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko and Gorbachev, from the Western leaders, from academies of sciences in different countries, and practically cooperation of Soviet science, Soviet academy with National Academy in America was impossible unless Sakharov be released from Gorky. So I see this as a result of international pressure on Soviet officials.
So this man is a traitor, an enemy of the state, Archie Brown. Is it as simple as pressure and reaction to that?
Well, I don't think that he's regarded as a traitor even by the Soviet leadership, though they regard him as a very difficult customer to deal with because a man of tremendous principle and high prestige, a distinguished scientist. I think that there are a couple of main reasons. One is that they do want to appeal to international opinion at a time when they've been having some success in doing so. But I think the other is that the reform-minded people within the Soviet system have been making some headway lately, and their influence has become greater. And they would certainly see the virtue of releasing Sakharov from his exile.
How deep-seated, do you think, Zhoris, are these reforms? Because it is still an arrestable offence to have certain kinds of religious beliefs. I mean, there is still widespread oppression of people in the Soviet Union.
No, I don't consider them as reforms in real sense. I consider them as kind of modifications and improvement in the administrative actions of the government, because real reforms would mean that the whole system start to change, that the freedom of press, freedom of expression, freedom of travel, and many other freedoms be introduced. So there were no any significant changes in human rights as such. There were some individual cases which indicate that there are some movement in right direction, but there was no actually so-called breakthrough.
Are these on the cards? Are these coming up? Is Mr. Gorbachev sincere? Is he in the process of real change?
I think there's a process, certainly, of change. There are a number of interesting things in the pipeline, legislation, a new law on deputies to the Soviets, which will probably introduce some competitive elections, at least at the lower level, a new law on enterprises, which will give more autonomy to factories. I would call these things reforms. It's true, of course, they don't change the fundamentals of the system, but that would be revolution, not reform. I think that we are seeing some real reform, or at least a process, for the first time for at least 20 years.
On the timing of this, of the release of Sakharov, would it be too cynical to think that there was some correlation between that and the announcement that nuclear testing will resume, sort of sugar with the bitter pill.
No, I don't think that two events are really linked together, because it was expected for quite a while that Soviet Union would not extend moratorium if Americans do not join it. So this is not unexpected. Release of Sakharov is really unexpected event, because only a few days ago the spokesman of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs did try to support the decision to keep Sakharov in Gorky, and suddenly he was released.
The question of the Conservatives with whom Mr. Gorbachev has to deal, Archie Brown, there is a power struggle going on at the moment, is there not? Which way are the scales tilted at the moment?
Well, I think that just lately Gorbachev has been gaining ground again. I mean, the old Brezhnev allies represent certainly part of the conservative opposition to him, and getting rid of Kunayev earlier this week was a good step for Gorbachev. But there are people, even people who were appointed by Mr. Andropov, such as Ligachev, the second secretary of the party, who seems to me less willing to go further down the road of reform than Gorbachev. And somebody like Mr. Gromyko, a man of high prestige, is rather conservative in comparison with Gorbachev. I see Gorbachev as being on the reform wing of his own Politburo, and so he still has quite a fight in his hands.
Jonas?
Yes, I do agree, because in Soviet Union, any leader, in order to become more and more influential, needs to create kind of his own party within the party, and Gorbachev in the process of doing just this. And we are now expecting the very important Central Committee plenum, I think next week or in few days' time, which was promised to consider problems of cadres, problems of new appointments, rejuvenation of the party apparatus, and dismissal of Kunayev is part of this process, and maybe quite a few more will follow.
Well, what is really fascinating, of course, about the dismissal of Kunayev is the riots that have followed it in Kazakhstan, and the fact that those riots, far from being hushed up as one might have expected, have been highly publicized through TASS. Why has this happened?
Well, first of all, Kunayev was in Kazakhstan for too many years, not only during Brezhnev time, but even before. He was president of the academy, then prime minister in Kazakhstan, then first secretary of Kazakhstan, and it's a very large country. He presided over many programs, including Virgin Land program and many others. And Kazakhstan was actually very successful in development of agricultural field.
But the actual publication of a riot, an anti-establishment, anti-government riot?
Yeah, it's not unexpected in the context of how Kunayev dismissal had been made. So apparently many Kazakh, particularly young students, would be very sensitive to the methods. The same riots happened, for example, in Georgia after Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956. There was very, very significant riots.
But Archie Brown, those were not reported.
No, I think that's the difference. Certainly there have been riots in the past, sometimes with an ethnic basis, but what's different this time is that it was reported, and this is a good example of the glassness or openness which is being talked about in the Soviet Union just now. We've seen many other recent examples of things being aired in the mass media which were unmentionable under Brezhnev.
Archie Brown, Zhores Medvedev, thank you.
And we should have said there that the interview with Ms. Radoshenskaya will be a full interview with her in The Observer. Just like to make that point. Well, in a moment, Will Hutton with a seasonal flavour on this year's merger mania in the city.
Radoshenskaya, who's in London for urgent medical treatment, has been describing for the first time the 4 years she spent in a Soviet labour camp. She held a news conference at Downing Street, where she'd been invited to a meeting with Mrs. Thatcher.